The red flag rose over the Kremlin in 1917 and fell 74 years later, and in between, the Soviet Union remade the world. This is the complete story of that transformation. It begins in the fractures of the Russian Empire, where peasants outnumbered nobles by the millions, where underground printing presses carried forbidden ideas through frozen cities, and where the catastrophe of the First World War cracked an ancient dynasty beyond repair. It moves through 2 revolutions in a single year, through a civil war of extraordinary brutality, and into the construction of something the world had never seen. A state built entirely on ideology, demanding total loyalty and promising total equality. The journey passes through Stalin's terror and his steel, through the most devastating war in human history, through the nuclear standoff that held the planet in tension for decades. It walks through communal apartments and collective farms, through cosmodrome launch pads and Gulag barracks, through the brief thaw of Khrushchev and the long stagnation of Brezhnev, and into the reforms that were meant to save the system, and instead ended it. The Soviet Union collapsed on December 25, 1991, but its borders, its weapons, its wounds, and its memory did not disappear. They became the world we still live in. If complete journeys through the rise and fall of great powers are what you seek, subscribe, and stay close. Every week, the full story of a world that shaped history. Let us begin. The land itself tells the story before any czar or revolutionary ever could. Stretching across 11 time zones, from the frozen Baltic coast to the volcanic rim of Kamchatka, the Russian Empire in the middle of the 19th century was less a nation than a world unto itself. A vast, slow-moving civilization held together by autocratic will, orthodox faith, and the sheer weight of distance. Birch forests gave way to steppe, steppe gave way to taiga, taiga dissolved into tundra. Rivers wider than some European countries drained southward into inland seas, and across this immensity, scattered in tens of thousands of villages of timber and mud, lived the overwhelming majority of the empire's people, the serfs. In 1861, Tsar Alexander II signed the Emancipation Reform, formally abolishing serfdom and releasing approximately 23 million bonded peasants from legal ownership by the nobility. It was the largest single act of social transformation in Russian history to that point. Yet liberation carried a bitter arithmetic. Freed peasants were required to purchase their land through redemption payments stretched over 49 years. The plots they received were often too small to sustain a family. The commune, the mir, retained collective control over land redistribution, binding the peasant to the village almost as firmly as the old system had. Freedom had arrived, but prosperity had not followed it through the door. St. Petersburg, meanwhile, wore a different face entirely. The imperial capital along the Neva River was a city of deliberate grandeur, its Baroque and neoclassical facades painted in pale yellows and greens, its canals reflecting the white nights of summer, its winter palace housing the Romanov court in a world of gilded halls and ceremonial distance from the empire they governed. The Tsar ruled by divine right, answerable to no parliament, no constitution, no elected body of any kind. The autocracy was not merely a political system. It was a theological claim that the emperor stood between God and the Russian people, and that to question his authority was to question the divine order itself. But beneath that order, pressure was building. By the 1890s, industrialization had begun transforming Russian cities with startling speed. Under Finance Minister Sergei Vita, the state drove railway construction at a furious pace. The Trans-Siberian Railway, begun in 1891, would eventually stretch over 9,000 kilometers, the longest rail line on Earth. Factories rose in St. Petersburg, Moscow, and the Donbass coalfields. By the census of 1897, the empire counted 125 million souls, a population growing faster than the agrarian economy could absorb. Workers crowded into factory barracks, laboring 12 to 14 hours a day in conditions that reformers described in terms of systematic degradation. It was in these conditions that revolutionary thought found its audience. The Russian Social Democratic Labour Party formed in 1898, drawing on the writings of Karl Marx to argue that history moved through class conflict toward an inevitable transformation. Underground printing presses produced pamphlets that circulated through factories and exile communities in Siberia. The Tsarist secret police, the Okhrana, tracked, arrested, and exiled thousands, but could not extinguish the movement. Among those exiled was a young lawyer from the Volga city of Simbirsk, Vladimir Ulyanov, who would later take the name Lenin. The crisis sharpened on the 9th of January 1905, a day that entered history as Bloody Sunday. A peaceful procession of workers and their families marched toward the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, carrying a petition to Tsar Nicholas II. Imperial troops opened fire. Hundreds were killed. The massacre shattered the popular image of the Tsar as a benevolent father figure and ignited a wave of strikes, mutinies, and uprisings across the empire. Nicholas was forced to issue the October Manifesto, promising a legislative assembly, the Duma, but the concessions were narrow and soon reversed. The revolution of 1905 failed, but it left a scar that would not heal. By 1916, the empire was bleeding from wounds it could not close. 2 years of catastrophic war against Germany and Austria-Hungary had consumed millions of soldiers, exhausted the treasury, and broken the supply lines feeding both the front and the cities. Nicholas II had taken personal command of the army, tying his own fate to every military failure. In Petrograd, the city renamed from its German-sounding original at the war's outbreak, bread queues stretched through winter streets. The court had grown strange and isolated, its inner circle shadowed by the figure of Grigory Rasputin, whose influence over the royal family deepened public contempt for the dynasty. The world the Tsar had built was still standing, but the foundations had already given way. The winter of 1917 arrived in Petrograd with a particular cruelty. The bread queues that had stretched through December grew longer still in January and February, winding past shuttered shop fronts and frost-glazed windows. The city's bakeries were running short, not because the grain had disappeared from Russia entirely, but because the railway network, already strained beyond its limits by 4 years of war, could no longer move supplies reliably from the countryside to the capital. Women stood in those queues before dawn, wrapped in whatever wool they owned, waiting for loaves that sometimes never came. It was in those queues, more than in any revolutionary pamphlet, that the dynasty's legitimacy finally expired. On the 23rd of February, 1917, International Women's Day by the revolutionary calendar, textile workers in the Vyborg district walked off their factory floors and into the streets. They were joined by metal workers, by students, by the simply hungry. Within 2 days, nearly 200,000 people had stopped working across the city. The strikes became marches. The marches moved toward the center. When the Tsar, still at military headquarters in Mogilev, ordered the Petrograd garrison to fire on the crowds, something unprecedented happened. The soldiers refused. Regiment after regiment turned away from their officers, and some crossed to the side of the demonstrators. The autocracy had always rested on the assumption that the army would obey. When that assumption broke, the system had nothing left beneath it. Nicholas II abdicated on the 2nd of March, 1917, signing away 3 centuries of Romanov rule in a railway carriage at Pskov. He attempted to pass the throne to his brother Michael, but Michael declined within a day. The dynasty simply ended, not with a battle, but with a signature and a silence. A provisional government formed from members of the old imperial parliament, the Duma, took formal authority. It was led first by Prince Georgy Lvov, then from July by the socialist lawyer Alexander Kerensky. The government made one decision above all others that would determine its fate. It chose to continue the war. That decision created the opening through which the Bolsheviks would eventually walk. Through the spring and summer, power in Petrograd was effectively divided between the provisional government and the Petrograd Soviet, a council of workers and soldiers' deputies that controlled the city's streets, its garrison, and its communications. Lenin arrived at Finland Station on the 3rd of April, returning from Swiss exile aboard a sealed train arranged with German assistance. He stepped onto the platform and immediately rejected any cooperation with the provisional government. His April theses demanded peace, land redistribution, and all power to the Soviets. To many it sounded extreme. Within months it would sound inevitable. The summer brought the July days, a premature uprising that the Bolsheviks neither fully controlled nor fully disowned. And then the Kornilov affair in August, when the army's commander attempted a march on Petrograd that collapsed before it reached the city. Each crisis weakened the provisional government further and strengthened the Bolsheviks, who had been rearming the Petrograd workers' militias, the Red Guards, throughout the autumn. By October, the Bolsheviks held majorities in the Petrograd and Moscow Soviets. Leon Trotsky, recently joined to the party, organized the Military Revolutionary Committee with methodical precision, assigning commissars to every military unit in the capital. On the night of the 25th of October, Red Guards and sailors from the Baltic Fleet moved through Petrograd in the dark, seizing the telegraph office, the railway stations, the state bank, and the bridges. The Winter Palace fell in the early hours of the 26th, not stormed dramatically, but entered through unlocked side doors after its defenders. A small force of officer cadets and a women's battalion offered little resistance. The provisional government's ministers were arrested. Kerensky had already fled. The Bolsheviks announced that power had passed to the Soviets. In January of 1918, when the long-promised Constituent Assembly finally met and produced a non-Bolshevik majority, it was dissolved after a single session. The revolution had consumed the very democracy it had promised to deliver. The new state that emerged from October was not yet a state in any stable sense. It held Petrograd and Moscow, but beyond those cities, the former Russian Empire was dissolving into armed factions, separatist movements, and competing claims of sovereignty. The Bolsheviks had seized power. Now they had to survive it. The first blow came from the war itself. In March of 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk stripped Russia of Ukraine, the Baltic provinces, Finland, and vast stretches of Belarusian and Caucasian territory, roughly a third of the empire's European population and a quarter of its agricultural land. It was a humiliation of staggering scale, accepted by Lenin as the price of ending a war the army could no longer fight. The peace bought time. It also ignited fury among those who believed the Bolsheviks had betrayed Russia to its enemies. By the summer of 1918, that fury had hardened into organized military resistance. The forces arrayed against the Bolsheviks, collectively known as the Whites, were never a unified movement. They were Tsarist officers, liberal politicians, Cossack commanders, and nationalist leaders who shared little beyond their opposition to Bolshevik rule. Admiral Alexander Kolchak commanded White forces in Siberia from his base at Omsk. General Anton Denikin led armies across the south, pushing north through Ukraine toward Moscow. General Nikolai Yudenich threatened Petrograd from the northwest. The fronts stretched across thousands of kilometers of steppe, taiga, and mountain. Foreign powers intervened as well. Britain, France, the United States, and Japan all landed troops on Russian soil, at Archangel, Vladivostok, Murmansk, and in the Caucasus, ostensibly to prevent war supplies from falling to Germany, but in practice supporting White resistance. The intervention was limited and ultimately ineffective, but it gave the Bolsheviks a powerful propaganda weapon, the image of a young workers' state besieged by capitalist powers from every direction. Leon Trotsky, appointed Commissar of War, built the Red Army from almost nothing. He reintroduced conscription, recruited former Tsarist officers under close political supervision, and traveled the fronts in an armored train that served as a mobile headquarters, printing press, and command center simultaneously. The train became a symbol of the Bolshevik method, improvised, relentless, ideologically charged. By 1920, the Red Army numbered more than 5 million soldiers. The Cheka, the secret police founded in December of 1917 under Felix Dzerzhinsky, became the instrument of internal control. In the summer and autumn of 1918, following an assassination attempt on Lenin and the killing of a senior Cheka official in Petrograd, the Bolsheviks declared the Red Terror. Thousands of suspected enemies, former nobles, clergy, political opponents, and ordinary citizens deemed hostile were arrested and executed without trial. The exact numbers remain disputed, but tens of thousands died in those months alone. The Checkers cellars, with their brick walls and single electric bulbs, became the defining image of revolutionary justice. On the night of the 16th and 17th of July, 1918, in a basement in Yekaterinburg, the former Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, their 5 children, and 4 members of their household staff were shot and bayoneted by a Cheka firing squad. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for 304 years, ended in that room. The bodies were transported to a forest outside the city and buried in secret. The execution removed any possibility of a monarchist restoration around a living figurehead. By 1921, the Whites had been defeated on every front. Kolchak was captured and shot in February of 1920. Denikin's armies collapsed and retreated to the Black Sea coast. Yudenich's advance on Petrograd was broken. The last significant White force, under General Pyotr Wrangel, was evacuated from Crimea in November of 1920. Foreign troops withdrew. The Bolsheviks had won the military war, but the human cost was catastrophic. Famine struck the Volga region in 1921 and 1922, driven by years of agricultural disruption, grain requisitioning, and drought. Villages along the Volga sat silent, their populations hollowed out by starvation. International relief organizations, including one led by the American Herbert Hoover, delivered food that saved millions of lives, a fact the Soviet state would later minimize. Estimates of total deaths from war, famine, and disease between 1917 and 1922 range from 7 to 12 million. The land that the Bolsheviks had won was exhausted, depopulated, and scarred beyond easy reckoning. Out of exhaustion, the Soviet state began to build. The land was broken, the economy in ruins, and the party that had seized power now faced a question more difficult than revolution itself: how to govern. The answer, in the early 1920s, came in two forms: a tactical economic retreat and a constitutional act that would define the century. The new economic policy, introduced by Lenin in 1921, was a frank acknowledgement of reality. Forced grain requisitioning had driven peasants to hide their harvests and resist the state. Industry had collapsed. The policy allowed small private traders to operate openly, permitted peasants to sell surplus grain on the market, and restored a limited commercial life to Soviet cities. In Moscow's markets, vendors reappeared behind wooden stalls piled with bread, cloth, and household goods. The figures who ran these small enterprises were called nepmen, a word that carried both tolerance and suspicion. The party permitted them because it needed them, but never trusted them. The new economic policy was always understood as temporary, a breathing space before the deeper transformation to come. On December 30th, 1922, the formal architecture of the new state was set in place. Representatives of the Russian, Ukrainian, Transcaucasian, and Byelorussian Soviet republics signed the treaty that created the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The Kremlin, its old imperial towers now hung with red banners, became the symbolic center of a federation that claimed to have transcended nationalism while organizing itself along national lines. The union was presented as voluntary, as a brotherhood of peoples liberated from Tsarist oppression. In practice, the party held the binding authority, and Moscow held the party. Lenin, the architect of this structure, was already failing. A series of strokes beginning in May 1922 progressively removed him from active leadership. From his room at the Gorky estate outside Moscow, he dictated notes and letters that revealed growing alarm, particularly about the man who had been appointed General Secretary of the Communist Party in April of that same year. Joseph Stalin had accumulated organizational power with quiet efficiency, placing loyalists throughout the party apparatus. Lenin's final letters, written in late 1922 and early 1923, warned the party leadership that Stalin had concentrated too much power in his hands and urged his removal from the Secretariat. Those letters were suppressed. Lenin died on January 21, 1924. The funeral procession that carried Lenin's body through Moscow drew hundreds of thousands into the frozen streets. Grief was real, but so was political calculation. Stalin delivered a ceremonial oath at the Congress of Soviets, pledging fidelity to Lenin's legacy in language that was almost liturgical. The decision to embalm Lenin's body and place it in a permanent mausoleum on Red Square, a structure of dark red granite and black labradorite built to endure, transformed the dead leader into a permanent icon. The mausoleum became a place of pilgrimage, and Lenin's image spread across every public wall in the Union. What followed was a contest for succession conducted through procedural maneuver and ideological accusation. Leon Trotsky, the organizer of the Red Army and the most publicly brilliant of the Bolshevik leaders, found himself outmaneuvered at every turn. Stalin built alliances first with Zinoviev and Kamenev against Trotsky, then turned against them in coalition with Bukharin. Trotsky was removed from command of the military in 1925, expelled from the party in 1927, and forced into exile in 1929. The debate was framed in ideological terms, permanent revolution versus socialism in one country, but the real stakes were organizational control. By the late 1920s, Stalin's position was dominant. The party congresses that had once hosted genuine argument became instruments of ratification. The propaganda apparatus produced images of Stalin alongside Lenin, constructing a continuity of authority that placed the General Secretary inside the founding myth of the Soviet state. Red banners carried both faces. Factory walls displayed both names. A new political language was taking shape, one in which loyalty, vigilance, and ideological correctness were the measures of a Soviet citizen's worth. The architecture of power was complete. What would be built inside it was still to come. The machinery of transformation began moving in 1928, and it moved with a force that no previous Russian government had ever attempted. Stalin's first five-year plan was not simply an economic program, it was a declaration of war against backwardness, against the peasantry, against the old rhythms of rural life that had governed the Russian countryside for centuries. The plan demanded that the Soviet Union industrialize at a speed that defied conventional economic logic. Steel production, coal output, electrical capacity, all were assigned targets that existing infrastructure could not possibly meet. The targets were issued anyway. On the Ukrainian steppe, the collectivization campaign descended on villages that had farmed the same black earth for generations. Peasants who had accumulated modest holdings under the new economic policy were now classified as kulaks, class enemies, and subjected to deportation, dispossession, and arrest. Collective farms, the kolkhozy, absorbed the land, the livestock, and the labor of millions. Grain quotas were set by the state and enforced by party brigades who moved from village to village, searching homes, emptying storage pits, and confiscating seed grain along with the harvest. By 1932 and 1933, the result was catastrophic. The famine that swept through Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and the North Caucasus killed between 3.5 and 7.5 million people. In Ukraine, it is remembered as the Holodomor, death by hunger. Villages emptied, fields went unharvested. The state continued to export grain, even as its own population starved. Far to the east, in the southern Ural Mountains, a different kind of transformation was underway. The city of Magnitogorsk rose from bare steppe between 1929 and 1932, a steel complex built by tens of thousands of workers, many of them mobilized by force, living in tents and wooden barracks through winters that reached 40 degrees below zero. By 1932, the Magnitogorsk steel plant was producing. By 1940, Soviet steel output had increased by more than 400% compared to 1928. The numbers were real. The cost behind them was equally real, though it appeared in no official ledger. Beneath Moscow, another monument to the Stalinist vision was taking shape. The Moscow Metro, begun in 1932 and opened in 1935, was designed not merely as transportation, but as a statement of civilizational arrival. Its stations were faced in marble, decorated with mosaics, fitted with chandeliers. Komsomolskaya Station, Mayakovskaya Station, Ploshchad Revolyutsy, each one a cathedral of socialist modernity, built by workers who labored in shifts around the clock beneath the city's streets. Ordinary Muscovites descended into these spaces and found something that the surface city could not always provide: grandeur, warmth, and the visible promise of a radiant future. Above ground, the terror was accelerating. The Great Purge, which reached its peak between 1936 and 1938, moved through the party, the military, the intelligentsia, and the general population with systematic ferocity. Show trials placed former Bolshevik leaders Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin before cameras and confessions, their guilt already determined before any verdict was announced. The NKVD under Nikolai Yezhov processed arrest quotas assigned by region. Approximately 750,000 people were executed during the purge years. The Gulag system, which had existed since the early 1920s, expanded to hold 1.8 million prisoners by 1938. Logging camps in Kolyma, canal construction in Karelia, gold mines in the frozen Far East. The Soviet Union was being built, in part, by the labor of those it had imprisoned. The architecture of power that had been assembled through the 1920s now revealed its interior, not the classless society promised in the founding texts, but a state capable of consuming its own architects without hesitation or pause. Beyond the purges and the party congresses, beyond the arrest quotas and the show trials, ordinary Soviet life continued, shaped, constrained, and in many ways genuinely transformed by the decade's relentless pressures. The 1930s were not only a time of terror, they were also a time of mass literacy, rapid urbanization, and the construction of an entirely new social world, one that millions of people inhabited with a mixture of genuine belief, careful compliance, and quiet adaptation. The communal apartment, the kommunalka, defined urban existence for the vast majority of Soviet city dwellers. A single large flat, once belonging to a bourgeois family, now housed 4, 5, or 6 separate families, each occupying one room. The kitchen was shared. The bathroom was shared. The narrow corridor, with its row of coat hooks and its smell of boiled cabbage and tobacco, was shared. Privacy was structural impossibility. Neighbors heard everything: arguments, illness, the sound of a child learning to read aloud. This enforced proximity created its own social codes, unspoken rules about cooking times, about noise after a certain hour, about which shelf in the communal refrigerator belonged to whom. The kommunalka was not merely a housing arrangement. It was a political space, where surveillance was built into the architecture of daily life. Outside the apartment, the city offered new institutions designed to fill Soviet citizens' hours with purpose. Workers' clubs, built in constructivist style during the 1920s and now operating at full capacity, hosted film screenings, lectures on Marxist theory, amateur theater productions, and chess tournaments. The Soviet state understood leisure as a domain to be organized, not left to chance. Cinema was particularly powerful. By the mid-1930s, Soviet film studios were producing dozens of features annually, many of them celebrating collective farm life, industrial heroism, or the wisdom of the party. Audiences filled the theaters in factory towns and regional capitals alike. For children, the Soviet state had built its own world. The Young Pioneer Organization enrolled children between the ages of 9 and 14, dressing them in white shirts and red neckerchiefs and organizing their summers around pioneer camps, vast outdoor complexes in birch forests and along river banks, where children drilled, sang, studied, and competed in athletic events. The camps were not merely recreational. They were ideological institutions designed to shape loyalty, discipline, and collective identity from the earliest possible age. The Komsomol, the Communist Union of Youth, extended this formation into adolescence and early adulthood, providing a structured path from childhood belief into adult party membership. In 1935, a coal miner named Alexei Stakhanov in the Donbass region reportedly mined 102 tons of coal in a single shift, 14 times the standard quota. Whether the feat was achieved precisely as described mattered less than what the state made of it. The Stakhanov movement was launched immediately, celebrating exceptional workers as socialist heroes. Stakhanovite portraits appeared in factories and newspapers. Workers who exceeded their quotas received bonuses, better housing, and public recognition. The movement was simultaneously a genuine expression of competitive pride and a tool for raising production norms across entire industries, meaning that yesterday's extraordinary achievement became tomorrow's expected standard. Literacy transformed the country in ways that no single policy announcement could fully capture. In 1917, fewer than 4 in 10 Soviet citizens could read. By 1939, more than 8 in 10 could. Schools multiplied across the republics. Libraries opened in collective farm villages. The printed word, in Russian and in dozens of national languages, reached populations that had never before had access to it. What that word contained was carefully controlled. But the act of reading itself, the capacity to engage with text, was real and permanent. Socialist realist art filled the walls of public buildings, train stations, and workers' clubs. Paintings depicted broad-shouldered workers gazing toward luminous horizons, collective farm women harvesting wheat under golden skies, Lenin addressing crowds with one arm extended. The aesthetic was deliberate, optimistic, monumental, accessible, and it created a visual language that saturated Soviet public space entirely. To live in the Soviet Union in the 1930s was to be surrounded, constantly, by images of the world as the state wished it to be seen. The images of luminous horizons and golden harvests were still fresh on the walls of workers' clubs when the border exploded. In the early hours of June 22, 1941, along a front stretching nearly 2,000 kilometers from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, German forces crossed into Soviet territory. Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in human history, began before dawn, with artillery barrages that lit the western sky orange and Luftwaffe bombers destroying Soviet aircraft on the ground before their crews could reach them. Within the first hours, hundreds of Soviet planes were lost. Within the first days, entire armies were encircled. The scale of the initial catastrophe was almost incomprehensible. Soviet commanders, many of them recently promoted after the purges had gutted the officer corps, struggled to respond to an assault that moved faster than their communication lines could track. Stalin, who had dismissed repeated intelligence warnings of a German attack, fell into a period of paralysis. The orders that did reach front-line units were often contradictory, delayed, or simply overtaken by events before they arrived. German armored columns advanced hundreds of kilometers in weeks, cutting off Soviet formations in enormous pockets. By the end of 1941, approximately 3.8 million Soviet soldiers had been taken prisoner, a number without precedent in modern warfare. Villages burned across Belorussia and Ukraine. The roads west of Minsk and Kiev filled with columns of retreating soldiers, displaced civilians, and livestock moving east in vast, exhausted streams. The Wehrmacht captured Minsk within a week. Kiev fell in September after a catastrophic encirclement that trapped over 600,000 Soviet troops. By October, German forces were within striking distance of Moscow itself. The defense of Moscow became a moment of existential weight. Stalin remained in the capital, a decision that carried enormous symbolic force. Factory workers were handed rifles and sent to dig anti-tank ditches in the frozen earth west of the city. Siberian divisions, equipped and trained for winter warfare, were transferred west by rail and committed to the defense. In November and early December, German forward units could see the spires of Moscow through their field glasses. The city did not fall. A Soviet counter-offensive launched on December 5th pushed the Wehrmacht back from the capital's outskirts, the first significant German retreat of the war. To the northwest, Leningrad had been encircled since September. The siege that began in 1941 would last 872 days. The city's population endured starvation on a systematic scale, with bread rations falling to 125 grams per day for civilians at the worst point of the winter of 1941-42. Hundreds of thousands died of hunger and cold. Supply convoys crossed the frozen surface of Lake Ladoga, the road of life, under German artillery fire, carrying food in and evacuating the weakest residents out. The city held. The war's turning point came in the south. In the summer of 1942, German forces drove toward the Volga River and the city of Stalingrad. The battle that followed, from August 1942 through February 1943, consumed both armies in close-quarters urban combat of extraordinary ferocity. Soviet defenders held the western bank of the Volga, fighting street by street, building by building, sometimes floor by floor. In November 1942, Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus, encircling the German Sixth Army under Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus. On February 2, 1943, Paulus surrendered. Nearly 300,000 Axis troops had been trapped. The strategic momentum of the war on the Eastern Front shifted, and it would not shift back. The Soviet Union had absorbed a blow that would have destroyed almost any other state. What held it together, the party apparatus, the capacity for industrial relocation eastward, the endurance of its soldiers and civilians, would define the years that followed. From Stalingrad, the Red Army began to move west. It moved slowly at first, grinding through the frozen steppe in the winter of 1943. Then, with gathering momentum, as the industrial machinery relocated east of the Urals, began feeding the front with tanks, artillery, and aircraft in quantities the Wehrmacht could no longer match. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943, the largest armored engagement in history, shattered Germany's last major offensive capacity on the Eastern Front. After Kursk, the direction of the war was no longer in question. Only its duration remained uncertain. The advance unfolded across an enormous front. Soviet forces recaptured Kiev in November 1943, swept through Ukraine and Belarus through 1944, and crossed into Poland as the summer offensives of Operation Bagration obliterated an entire German army group. By the autumn of that year, Red Army columns were approaching the borders of East Prussia, Romania, and the Balkans. Eastern European capitals that had lived under German occupation for years now watched a different army arrive, one bearing red banners and the weight of an ideology that would reshape their futures entirely. The conferences at Yalta in February 1945 and Potsdam in July and August of that year formalized what military reality had already established. Stalin sat across from Churchill and Roosevelt, then Truman, and negotiated the post-war order with the quiet authority of a man whose armies occupied half the continent. The agreements reached there: spheres of influence, occupation zones, the fate of Poland, drew lines across Europe that would hold for nearly half a century. Berlin fell in May of 1945. Soviet forces entered the city from the east, fighting through rubble and burning streets in some of the most brutal urban combat of the entire war. On the 2nd of May, the city's garrison surrendered. Soviet soldiers raised the red flag over the shattered dome of the Reichstag, an image that became one of the defining photographs of the 20th century. The ruins of the German capital, stretching for kilometers in every direction, bore witness to the scale of what the war had consumed. Victory came at a cost almost impossible to comprehend. Approximately 27 million Soviet citizens died between 1941 and 1945, soldiers and civilians alike, killed in battle, in sieges, in occupation atrocities, in the Gulag, in famine brought on by wartime devastation. Entire regions had been reduced to ash. Thousands of villages had ceased to exist. The demographic wound cut so deep that its effects shaped Soviet society for decades. Yet from that devastation, the Soviet Union emerged as one of only two global superpowers. The Eastern Bloc took shape through the late 1940s. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and the eastern portion of Germany all fell under Soviet-aligned governments, installed through a combination of political pressure, electoral manipulation, and the physical presence of Red Army forces. Yugoslavia under Tito maintained a degree of independence that Stalin found intolerable but could not easily suppress. The Iron Curtain, as it came to be called in the West, descended across the continent. The atomic question dominated the final years of the decade. The United States had used nuclear weapons against Japan in August 1945, and the Soviet leadership understood immediately that the strategic balance had shifted. Stalin directed an accelerated weapons program, drawing on intelligence gathered during the war and the scientific capacity of the Soviet state. On the 29th of August, 1949, the first Soviet atomic device was detonated at the Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan. The American monopoly was broken. The arms race that would define the next 4 decades had begun. Stalin, in his final years, grew increasingly isolated and erratic. His court at the Kuntsevo dacha outside Moscow operated under conditions of fear and ritual that had calcified over decades. The aging dictator, suspicious of nearly everyone around him, launched new waves of ideological campaigns. The anti-cosmopolitan purges of the late 1940s, the Leningrad Affair, and in his final months the so-called Doctor's Plot, which many in the party feared was the prelude to another mass purge. On the 5th of March 1953, Stalin died. The men who had served him gathered around his body uncertain, for the first time in a generation, of what came next. The men who gathered around Stalin's body in March of 1953 had spent their careers learning how to survive him. Lavrenti Beria, the feared head of the secret police, moved first, releasing political prisoners, signaling openness, positioning himself as a reformer. Georgy Malenkov assumed the premiership. Nikita Khrushchev, a stocky Ukrainian-born party veteran who had overseen collectivization and survived the purges, took the post of first secretary of the Communist Party. For a brief period, the Soviet leadership operated as something resembling a collective. Then, in June of 1953, Beria was arrested in a Kremlin meeting room by his own colleagues, tried in secret, and shot. The most dangerous man in the Soviet state was gone within months of the dictator who had empowered him. Khrushchev consolidated his position steadily through 1954 and 55, outmaneuvering Malenkov and establishing himself as the dominant figure in the Politburo. The atmosphere in Moscow was already changing. Political prisoners were returning from the Gulag, gaunt, aged, carrying memories that the state had tried to bury in permafrost. Families were reunited. Questions that had been unspeakable for 2 decades began to surface in whispered conversations in communal apartment kitchens and university corridors. The moment of rupture came on the 25th of February, 1956. In a closed session of the 20th Party Congress in Moscow, Khrushchev delivered what became known as the secret speech. For 4 hours he catalogued Stalin's crimes, the fabricated confessions, the mass executions, the deportation of entire peoples, the cult of personality that had deformed Soviet political life. The speech was not intended for publication, but it was read aloud at party meetings across the country, and its contents spread. The effect was seismic. For millions of Soviet citizens, it was the first official acknowledgement that the terror had been real, that the state itself had committed crimes against its own people. The thaw, as the writer Ilya Ehrenberg named it, brought a brief flowering of Soviet cultural life. Censorship loosened at its edges. Literary journals published works that would have meant arrest a decade earlier. Alexander Solzhenitsyn's short novel, about a single day in a labor camp, would appear in 1962 with Khrushchev's personal approval. Soviet citizens began reading more freely, debating more openly, and testing the boundaries of what the system would permit. But the limits of the thaw revealed themselves almost immediately. In October of 1956, Hungary erupted. Inspired partly by the secret speech, Hungarian reformers and students demanded the withdrawal of Soviet troops and the end of one-party rule. Soviet tanks entered Budapest on the 4th of November. The uprising was crushed within days. Thousands were killed. The Hungarian leader Imre Nagy was arrested, secretly tried, and executed in 1958. The message was unmistakable. De-Stalinization had boundaries, and those boundaries were enforced with armor. 1 year after Hungary, on the 4th of October 1957, a small metal sphere the size of a beach ball was launched from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite, completed an orbit of the Earth in 96 minutes. Its radio signal, a simple repeating beep, was audible to amateur receivers across the globe. The launch announced Soviet technological capability in terms no diplomatic communique could match. Yuri Gagarin's flight into orbit followed on the 12th of April, 1961, and the Soviet space program became the most visible symbol of a system that claimed to be building the future. The most dangerous moment of the Khrushchev era came in October of 1962. American reconnaissance aircraft photographed Soviet ballistic missile installations under construction in Cuba. For 13 days, the United States and the Soviet Union stood at the edge of nuclear war. Soviet ships carrying additional military equipment turned back from an American naval blockade. Negotiations conducted through back channels produced an agreement. Soviet missiles withdrawn from Cuba, American missiles quietly removed from Turkey. The crisis passed, but it left both superpowers shaken. Khrushchev's authority never fully recovered. His impulsive style, his agricultural failures, and his handling of the Cuban crisis had eroded confidence within the Politburo. On the 14th of October, 1964, while Khrushchev was on holiday at a Black Sea resort, his colleagues voted him out of office. He was replaced by Leonid Brezhnev. The thaw was over. Leonid Brezhnev arrived at the summit of Soviet power without drama. He was a broad-shouldered man from the Ukrainian industrial city of Dniprodzerzhinsk, a party functionary who had risen through the machinery of Stalinist administration and survived every subsequent purge by remaining useful, loyal, and unthreateningly competent. Where Khrushchev had been volatile and improvisational, Brezhnev was deliberate. Where Khrushchev had gambled, Brezhnev consolidated. The Politburo that elevated him in October of 1964 wanted stability above all else, and stability was precisely what Brezhnev understood how to provide. The early years of his leadership carried genuine momentum. The Soviet space program, which had stunned the world with Sputnik and Yuri Gagarin, continued to push outward. Alexei Leonov had conducted the first spacewalk in March of 1965. Soviet engineers were designing lunar probes, orbital stations, and intercontinental ballistic missiles with a confidence born of genuine technical achievement. The Baikonur Cosmodrome in the Kazakh steppe, a vast complex of launch pads, assembly buildings, and tracking stations spread across the flat semi-desert, hummed with activity. The competition with the United States was not merely ideological. It was engineering, it was physics, it was national prestige measured in orbital trajectories. But the space race was already tilting. When American astronauts landed on the Moon in July of 1969, the Soviet program, which had been pursuing its own lunar mission in secret, fell silent on the subject. The Soviet Union never officially acknowledged it had been racing to the Moon at all. The moment passed without public admission of defeat, absorbed into the official narrative of Soviet scientific achievement in other domains. On the ground, the more immediate test came in the spring of 1968. In Czechoslovakia, the Communist Party leader Alexander Dubček had launched a program of liberalization, loosening censorship, permitting political debate, proposing a socialism with a human face. The Prague Spring, as it became known, drew enormous popular enthusiasm. For Brezhnev and the Politburo, it represented something far more dangerous than reform. It was a precedent. If one Warsaw Pact state could redefine socialism on its own terms, others might follow. On the night of the 20th of August, 1968, Warsaw Pact forces, Soviet, Polish, East German, Hungarian, and Bulgarian, crossed into Czechoslovakia. 500,000 troops moved through the darkness. By morning, tanks stood in Wenceslas Square in Prague. Dubček was arrested and flown to Moscow. The reforms were reversed. What followed was called normalization, a word that meant the restoration of obedience. The Brezhnev Doctrine, articulated in the months that followed, stated plainly that the Soviet Union reserved the right to intervene in any socialist country where socialism itself was threatened. The boundaries of permissible change had been drawn in tank tracks across cobblestone streets. Détente with the West developed alongside this internal rigidity. In May of 1972, United States President Richard Nixon visited Moscow, the first such visit by an American president, and signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, known as SALT I. The agreement placed caps on intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine-launched ballistic missiles, acknowledging for the first time that both superpowers had an interest in managing the arms race rather than simply winning it. 3 years later, in 1975, Soviet and American spacecraft docked in orbit during the Apollo-Soyuz mission, a brief, carefully staged moment of cooperation between systems that remained fundamentally opposed. Beneath the surface of these diplomatic achievements, the Soviet economy was beginning its long deceleration. Growth rates that had reached 5% annually in the 1960s slowed to under 2% by the late 1970s. The centrally planned system, effective at mobilizing resources for specific industrial targets, proved incapable of generating the kind of distributed innovation that a modern economy required. Factory managers met their quotas by producing what the plan demanded, not what consumers needed. Shelves in state stores held goods that nobody wanted, while goods that people wanted remained unavailable. The gap between official statistics and lived reality widened year by year. Brezhnev himself aged visibly through the 1970s, his speech slowing, his public appearances growing shorter and more ceremonial. He accumulated medals and honors on a scale that became quietly absurd. By the end of his life, he held over 100 decorations, including the Lenin Prize for Literature, for a memoir widely understood to have been written by others. The Politburo around him aged in parallel, a gerontocracy of men in identical grey suits presiding over a system that had lost the capacity for self-correction. On the 10th of November, 1982, Brezhnev died at his dacha outside Moscow. He left behind a superpower that was vast, nuclear-armed, and slowly hollowing from within. The decision to send Soviet forces into Afghanistan was made quietly, by a small group of aging men who believed they were preventing a catastrophe. In late December of 1979, the Politburo, led by Brezhnev, Defense Minister Dmitry Ustinov, and Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko, authorized what they called a limited contingent. The word invasion was never used in official documents. The operation was framed as fraternal assistance to a socialist ally in crisis. On the 24th of December, Soviet transport aircraft began landing at Kabul airport. By the 27th, special forces had stormed the Taj Beg Palace and killed Afghan leader Hafizullah Amin. A Soviet-backed replacement, Babrak Karmal, was installed within hours. The 40th Army crossed the Amu Darya River and moved south into a country that no foreign power had ever successfully subdued. The landscape that received them was ancient and indifferent. The Hindu Kush Mountains rose in jagged ridge lines above narrow valleys, where villages of mud brick had stood for centuries. Soviet helicopter gunships, the Mi-8 and the Mi-24, moved through this terrain in formation, their rotors echoing off stone walls. Below them, the roads were thin and exposed, winding through passes where ambush was not a possibility, but a certainty. The Mujahideen, the armed resistance fighters who drew their identity from Islamic faith and tribal loyalty, knew every fold of the land. They had no air force, no tanks, no centralized command. What they had was patience, knowledge of the terrain, and increasingly, outside support. The United States, through the Central Intelligence Agency and in coordination with Pakistani intelligence, began channeling weapons and funding to the resistance almost immediately. The program, known as Operation Cyclone, grew steadily through the early 1980s and expanded dramatically after 1985. Shoulder-fired Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, supplied from 1986 onward, changed the balance in the air. Soviet helicopters that had once operated with near impunity began to fall. The cost of controlling Afghan airspace rose sharply. For Soviet conscripts, young men from Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Uzbekistan, and the Russian heartland, Afghanistan was a war unlike anything their training had prepared them for. They fought in extreme heat and extreme cold, in terrain that negated the advantages of armored columns. The enemy dissolved into the population and reappeared in the mountains. Villages that appeared calm harbored supply lines. Roads that had been cleared were mined again by morning. The psychological toll accumulated alongside the physical one. Approximately 15,000 Soviet soldiers died over the course of the decade. Many more returned with wounds, with addiction to locally available narcotics, and with experiences that Soviet society had no framework to acknowledge or absorb. The zinc coffins, sealed, often delivered without explanation to families in provincial cities, became a symbol of the war's hidden cost. Official Soviet media referred to the conflict obliquely as the fulfillment of internationalist duty. Casualties were not announced. Funerals were discouraged from becoming public gatherings. But the coffins kept arriving, and the silence around them became its own form of knowledge. By the mid-1980s, the war had consumed vast resources and produced no stable outcome. An estimated 1 million Afghan civilians died during the decade of conflict. Millions more fled to Pakistan and Iran, creating one of the largest refugee populations in the world. The Afghan state that Soviet forces were nominally defending remained fragile, dependent, and contested. Gorbachev, who came to power in March of 1985, called Afghanistan a bleeding wound. He was not speaking metaphorically. The Geneva Accords, signed on the 14th of April, 1988, set the framework for Soviet withdrawal. On the 15th of February, 1989, the last Soviet column crossed the Friendship Bridge over the Amu Darya, led by General Boris Gromov. The war was over. What it had done to the Soviet state, to its treasury, its military confidence, its moral authority at home, would take years to fully measure, and some of it would never be fully measured at all. Mikhail Gorbachev was 54 years old when the Politburo elected him General Secretary on the 11th of March, 1985. He was younger than any Soviet leader since Stalin had consolidated power, and he moved differently, with energy, with directness, with a willingness to speak in public without reading from a prepared text. After the slow procession of dying men who had led the Soviet Union through its final Brezhnev years, Andropov gone after 15 months, Chernenko after 13, Gorbachev's arrival felt like a change in atmospheric pressure. The system he inherited was not yet in crisis, but it was deeply, structurally unwell. The economy had been slowing for more than a decade. Central planning, which had driven the industrialization of the 1930s and the Reconstruction of the 1950s, had grown rigid and unresponsive. Factory managers reported false production figures. Ministries allocated resources according to targets that bore little relation to actual need. Consumer goods were scarce, queues were long, and the gap between official Soviet statistics and lived Soviet reality had become a quiet, universal joke. Oil revenues, which had sustained the budget through the 1970s, were falling as global prices collapsed. Afghanistan was draining the treasury. The military consumed roughly a quarter of gross domestic product. Gorbachev understood that the system required transformation. What he did not fully understand, what perhaps no one inside the system could fully understand, was how little margin remained for error. His first reform program was called perestroika, meaning restructuring. It aimed to decentralize economic decision-making, allow state enterprises limited autonomy, and reduce the suffocating weight of bureaucratic control. It was not capitalism. Gorbachev was explicit on this point. It was socialism renewed, socialism made efficient, socialism that could compete. Alongside perestroika came glasnost, openness. Censorship was loosened. Newspapers began printing stories that would have meant arrest a decade earlier. The magazine Ogonyok published investigations into Stalinist crimes. Soviet television broadcast live debates. Citizens wrote letters to editors and received answers. The effect was electric and, for the system, deeply destabilizing. A society that had been told for 70 years that its history was heroic and its present was advancing now began to read a different account of both. Then came Chernobyl. On the 26th of April, 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power station in Soviet Ukraine exploded during a safety test. The explosion and subsequent fire released radioactive material across a vast area of Ukraine, Belarus, and beyond. The initial Soviet response was characteristic of the old system: concealment, minimization, the instinct to manage information before managing the disaster. But glasnost, even in its early form, made total concealment impossible. The scale of the catastrophe forced acknowledgement. Gorbachev later described Chernobyl as a turning point, not only an environmental and human disaster, but a revelation of systemic failure, of the gap between Soviet institutional confidence and Soviet institutional competence. By 1988 and 1989, the forces that glasnost had released were moving faster than perestroika could channel them. Across the Baltic republics of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, incorporated into the Soviet Union by force in 1940, never fully reconciled to that incorporation, popular movements were forming under the banner of national sovereignty. On the 23rd of August, 1989, the 50th anniversary of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that had sealed their fate, approximately 2 million people joined hands across all 3 republics in a human chain stretching nearly 700 kilometers from Tallinn to Vilnius. It was called the Baltic Way. It was peaceful, organized, and unmistakable in its meaning. On the 9th of November, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Gorbachev did not order Soviet tanks to stop it. The world that the Cold War had built was coming apart, and the man who had set the process in motion was watching it accelerate beyond any plan he had made. The wall had fallen, but the Union still stood, formally at least. What changed in the months that followed was the speed at which its internal architecture began to give way. The Baltic republics had been the loudest voices, but they were not the only ones. Across the vast territory of the Soviet Union, from the Caucasus to Central Asia to the Slavic heartland, the question that had been suppressed for 7 decades was surfacing with new urgency. What did it mean to be Georgian, Ukrainian, Uzbek, or Moldovan inside a state that had always insisted those identities were secondary? Lithuania moved first and most decisively. On the 11th of March, 1990, the Lithuanian Supreme Soviet voted to restore the independent republic that Soviet annexation had extinguished in 1940. The declaration was unambiguous. It did not ask for negotiation or a gradual transition. It stated that Lithuania had never legally ceased to exist as a sovereign state, and that the occupation was now over. Vytautas Landsbergis, a musicologist turned political leader, became the face of that declaration, calm, professorial, and utterly unbending. Moscow's response was a combination of legal pressure, economic blockade, and barely concealed fury. Gorbachev declared the declaration null and void. The gas pipelines to Lithuania were throttled. But the crowds in Vilnius did not disperse. The pressure intensified in January of 1991. Soviet paratroopers and special forces moved against key installations in Vilnius, seizing the printing house and moving toward the television tower. On the night of the 13th of January, armored vehicles rolled through the Lithuanian capital. 13 civilians were killed when troops stormed the tower. The images, unarmed people standing between soldiers and a broadcast antenna, traveled around the world. A similar operation in Riga days later killed 5 more. Rather than breaking the independence movement, the violence hardened it. Crowds surrounded the parliament building in Vilnius and stood through the cold nights, building barricades from whatever was at hand. Gorbachev attempted to reframe the crisis through a constitutional mechanism. On the 17th of March, 1991, a union-wide referendum asked Soviet citizens whether they wished to preserve a reformed federation. The Baltic republics, Armenia, Georgia, and Moldova refused to participate. But in the 9 republics that did hold the vote, 76% of participants said yes to a renewed union. The result gave Gorbachev a mandate, or so he believed. Negotiations over a new union treaty began in earnest through the spring and summer of that year, centered at the Novo Ogaryovo state residence outside Moscow. What those negotiations could not resolve was the pace of change. Boris Yeltsin, elected president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic by popular vote in June of 1991, represented a different kind of authority, one drawn from a direct democratic mandate rather than party appointment. Russia itself was now asserting sovereignty within the union it nominally led. The paradox was dizzying. The largest republic was pulling away from the center even as the center tried to hold everything together. The breaking point came in August. On the 19th of that month, a group of senior officials, the vice president, the defense minister, the head of the security services, the prime minister, announced that Gorbachev was ill and unable to govern. They called themselves the State Committee for the State of Emergency. Gorbachev was at his dacha in Foros, on the Crimean coast, effectively under house arrest. The coup plotters appeared on television, visibly nervous, their hands trembling at the press conference table. Tanks moved into Moscow, but the population did not comply. Yeltsin climbed atop one of those tanks outside the Russian parliament building and declared the coup unconstitutional. Crowds gathered. Soldiers hesitated. Within 3 days, the committee had collapsed. Gorbachev returned to Moscow on the 22nd of August, but to a country that had already moved past him. When Gorbachev returned to Moscow on the 22nd of August, 1991, the city he came back to was not the one he had left. The coup had failed, but its failure had not restored his authority. It had transferred power elsewhere, to the republics, to the crowds, to the men who had stood against the tanks. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the institution that had governed every corner of Soviet life for 7 decades, was suspended within days. Its offices were sealed. Its archives were frozen. The red banners that had hung from government buildings across 15 republics began coming down, one by one, in the weeks that followed. The independence declarations accelerated through September and into October. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had already been recognized internationally. Now Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, and the Central Asian republics moved formally toward sovereignty. Each declaration was its own quiet earthquake, a legislature voting, a flag changing, a name on a map acquiring new weight. The union that Lenin had assembled, that Stalin had held together through terror, that Brezhnev had administered through inertia, was dissolving not through war, but through paperwork and political will. Gorbachev attempted to negotiate a new union treaty, a looser arrangement that might preserve some common framework. But the momentum had shifted beyond his reach. The largest and most consequential question was Ukraine. On the 1st of December, 1991, Ukrainian citizens voted in a referendum on independence. Over 90% voted yes. Without Ukraine, the largest Slavic republic after Russia, any reconstituted union was a fiction. The result made what followed inevitable. 7 days later, on the 8th of December, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met at a hunting lodge in the Belaveja forest in western Belarus. Boris Yeltsin of Russia, Leonid Kravchuk of Ukraine, and Stanislav Shushkevich of Belarus signed a document of extraordinary brevity and consequence. It declared that the Soviet Union, as a subject of international law, had ceased to exist. In its place, the 3 founding Slavic republics established the Commonwealth of Independent States, a loose consultative body with no central authority, no shared army, no binding ideology. The state that had launched Sputnik, defeated Nazi Germany, and contested global dominance with the United States was dissolved by 3 signatures in a forest. On the 21st of December, in Alma-Ata, the capital of Kazakhstan, 11 of the 15 former Soviet republics signed the Alma-Ata Declaration, formally expanding the Commonwealth of Independent States. The 3 Baltic states declined to join. Georgia was absent. The declaration confirmed what the Belaveja Accords had announced. The Union was gone. Gorbachev held on for 4 more days. On the 25th of December, 1991, he sat before a television camera in the Kremlin and delivered his resignation address. He spoke of what had been attempted, of the reforms that had opened Soviet society, of the end of the Cold War. At 7 minutes past 7 in the evening, he signed the decree transferring control of Soviet nuclear weapons to Boris Yeltsin. The transfer was complete. The office of President of the Soviet Union ceased to exist at that moment, though the flag still flew. At 7:32 in the evening, the red banner of the Soviet Union, the hammer and sickle on a field of deep crimson, was lowered from the flagpole above the Senate Tower of the Kremlin. The Russian tricolor rose in its place. The ceremony was brief, almost administrative. No crowd had gathered below. The cameras recorded it. The wind moved the new flag. Somewhere in the building's long corridors, the lights still burned in offices that now belonged to a state that no longer existed. Desks still holding the stationery of a dissolved empire. Telephones connected to a network whose central authority had just vanished into history. The offices fell silent, but the world they had governed did not. 15 states emerged from the wreckage of December 1991, each inheriting a different fragment of the Soviet experience, its infrastructure, its borders, its unresolved grievances, and its unspent ideological weight. The transition was not orderly. It was, in most places, brutal. In Russia, the 1990s arrived like a cold wind through a broken window. The government of Boris Yeltsin embraced shock therapy, a rapid dismantling of the planned economy in favor of market forces. State enterprises were privatized at speed, often transferred to well-connected insiders who became known as oligarchs. Inflation consumed savings overnight. Factories that had produced steel and turbines and military hardware for decades stood idle, their workers unpaid for months at a stretch. Russia's gross domestic product fell by roughly 40% between 1991 and 1998. The physical evidence was everywhere. Crumbling apartment blocks, shuttered plants, pensioners selling personal belongings on street corners in the January cold. The borders the Soviet Union had drawn, often deliberately complex, designed to prevent any single republic from becoming too cohesive, became fault lines. In December of 1994, Russian federal forces entered Chechnya, a small republic in the North Caucasus that had declared independence. The First Chechen War lasted nearly 2 years and ended in a humiliating Russian withdrawal. A second war followed in 1999, prosecuted with greater ferocity under a new leader named Vladimir Putin. The conflict reshaped Russian domestic politics for a generation. The nuclear question was resolved with unusual speed. Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan had inherited Soviet warheads on their territory, together constituting one of the largest nuclear arsenals on Earth. The Budapest Memorandum, signed in December of 1994, secured the transfer of those weapons to Russia in exchange for guarantees of sovereignty and territorial integrity from Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. The weapons moved. The guarantees, as events would later demonstrate, proved fragile. Across the former bloc, Soviet monuments were dismantled with varying degrees of ceremony. In the Baltic states, Lenin statues came down within months. In Central Asia, many remained standing for years, repainted or quietly relocated. In some Russian cities, they still stand today, not as endorsements, but as fixtures of a landscape that has not fully decided what to remember. The Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, from which Sputnik and Gagarin had launched, continued operating under a Russian lease agreement, its concrete launch pads still sending rockets into orbit decades after the flag that built them was folded away. Chernobyl's exclusion zone became a kind of unintended monument, 30 kilometers of abandoned villages, overgrown streets, and silent reactor halls preserved by contamination rather than intention. The forest reclaimed Pripyat slowly, pushing through asphalt and window frames, indifferent to the political transformations occurring beyond its perimeter. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine, citing historical claims and the protection of Russian-speaking populations, arguments that drew directly on Soviet-era demographic engineering, when Moscow had redrawn populations and borders as instruments of control. In February of 2022, a full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine began, the largest land war in Europe since 1945. The conflict's roots ran through every layer of Soviet history: the Holodomor, the forced Russification of non-Russian peoples, the artificial borders, the suppressed national identities. What the Soviet Union had compressed for 7 decades was releasing itself with enormous force. The Moscow metro still runs deep beneath the capital, its marble stations unchanged, chandeliers burning above commuters who pass beneath socialist-realist mosaics without looking up. Stalin's 7 skyscrapers still anchor the Moscow skyline, their wedding cake silhouettes rising above glass towers built in a different century for a different kind of power. On the 9th of May each year, veterans wearing Soviet medals march across Red Square, and the red banner appears again, carried not by a state, but by memory. The Soviet Union lasted 69 years. It reshaped the map of the world, the trajectory of science, the meaning of ideology, and the lives of hundreds of millions of people across 1/6 of the Earth's surface. What remains is not a ghost. It is a foundation, cracked in places, load-bearing in others, still beneath everything that came after. Thank you for watching this journey through one of history's most extraordinary and consequential experiments in human organization. If these stories have moved or informed you, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next.